Hello everyone. I don't know about you, but Halloween is my favorite holiday, and with the spooky season upon us, I thought it would be worth talking about the history of this time of year. Halloween is an awfully pagan-seeming holiday, but considering the surprisingly non-pagan origins of Easter I talked about in my video on that topic, just how pagan is Halloween, really? Well, there are two conflicting positions on this. One is that Halloween is derived primarily from the Christian observance of All Hallows' Eve, while the other identifies the Celtic festival of Samhain as the main ancestor of Halloween. To find the truth, we'll need to explain a bit more about each of these festivals, and the arguments for each as Halloween's main influence. Samhain is a Gaelic word which can be directly translated as summer's end, and was widely practiced across much of modern-day Ireland and Scotland, as well as the Isle of Man. Similar festivals were also practiced by the Celtic populations of Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany, though each of these were known by a variation of a different name, meaning the first day of winter. Regardless of the name, this holiday was celebrated on November 1st, and as the Celts considered days to begin and end at sunset rather than midnight, celebrations would begin on what we'd consider the evening of October 31st, just like Halloween. While we don't know much about Samhain for sure, Irish sagas suggest that during Samhain, the barrier between humans and the supernatural was broken down, and we know that the Celts built great bonfires at this time, possibly to ward off evil spirits, or possibly for some sort of divination. All Hallows' Day, or All Saints' Day, is a Christian feast day intended to commemorate saints and martyrs of the Church. It is followed by All Souls' Day, a day dedicated to prayers and almsgiving on behalf of the souls of the recently deceased, in the hopes of helping them pass more quickly into heaven. As part of a tradition going back to the early Church, major feasts would be preceded by vigils starting the night before. Hence, the night before All Hallows' Day was marked as All Hallows' Evening, abbreviated as Hallows E'en in Scots, and from there into Halloween. All Hallows' Eve, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day formed a unit known as Hallowmas, and the traditions associated with the three would often blur together, with the former being as much about the souls of the recently dead as saints or martyrs. Some people have suggested that All Hallows' Day was developed to hijack Samhain and help the spread of Christianity in Ireland. However, while All Hallows' Day would eventually be practiced on November 1st, this was not always the case. In the early Church, precursors to All Saints' Day were largely practiced in the spring. As early as the 4th century, the 13th of May was one of these dates, and when Pope Boniface IV rededicated the Roman Pantheon to Saint Mary and all the martyrs in 609, he chose to do so on this day, marking May 13th as the official All Saints' Day. Oh, and since we're talking about a potential Christian hijacking of a pagan festival in this video, I'd be remiss not to mention that the 13th of May had previously marked the ancient Roman festival of Lemuralia, during which the Romans would give offerings of food to placate or ward off malevolent spirits in their homes. Sound familiar? Anyway, while there's a case to be made that it was supposed to replace a different pagan festival in Rome, it's clear that All Hallows' Day wasn't created specifically to replace Samhain. That said, can we rule out the possibility of the date being moved to November 1st to replace Samhain? Well, there's more pointing against this suggestion than to it. Rome was basically the only place that stuck to the May 13th date. In Syria, it was during Easter week, and among the Greeks, on the Sunday after Pentecost. By 800, England and Germany were celebrating on our key date of November 1st. In Ireland, however, where we most associate with Samhain, it was commemorated on the 20th of April. This would certainly seem to point against the choice of November 1st relating to Samhain, though I will note that while there's no version of Samhain in Germany, it's not out of the question that, given how widespread variations of Samhain were among Celtic populations in the British Isles, the practice could have passed on to the pre-Christian English through heavy contact with Celts. As such, we probably can't totally rule out the possibility that replacing Samhain, or some variation of it, motivated the Germanic churches to shift All Hallows' Day to November 1st, especially considering that this change is attested in England earlier than in Germany, in 735. We can say, however, that Ireland wasn't involved. So, we're in a bit of an iffy place here. But how about if we look to actual practices? Well, according to one article I found, the practice of bobbing for apples goes back to Samhain, but they didn't provide a source, so I'm not sure whether that's true. A clearer example is the practice of great purifying bonfires, which were built in English graveyards to ward off evil spirits, though this practice isn't so much a Halloween tradition today. For most of our current Halloween traditions, evidence for Gaelic antecedents is lacking. Instead, it seems that the majority of Halloween practices originated well after Christianization. The practice of trick-or-treating, going door-to-door in costume and asking for candy, likely stems from the medieval practice of souling. Around 1380, the English preacher John Merck described this practice as, "Wherefore in olden time good men and women would this day buy bread and deal it for the souls that they loved, hoping with each loaf to get a soul out of purgatory." From this came the practice of baking soul cakes, which would be given to relatives and poor neighbors in exchange for their promise to pray for the souls in purgatory. The poor begging for them evolved into the more general practice of people, especially though not exclusively children, going door to door doing so, with attestations of this practice going back to the early 16th century. Another practice associated with souling was the carrying of special lanterns carved from turnips, possibly representing souls trapped in purgatory. These lanterns represent a clear ancestor of today's jack-o'-lanterns, which made the transition from turnips to the larger pumpkins when the practice was brought to America by Irish immigrants. The donning of costumes is attested in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales from the 16th century, possibly originating as a way of hiding from the sight of vengeful ghosts, who were believed to return on Hallowmas. With all this in mind, we can say that when people call Samhain the original Halloween, they are, at best, exaggerating. Almost nothing recognizably Halloween can be tied to Samhain in particular, and most Halloween practices are only attested well into the Christian era. However, it's also not clear that Halloween is totally distinct from earlier pagan traditions. Halloween traditions like guising and carving jack-o'-lanterns may have originated in the Christian era, assuming they don't trace back to unattested folk practices that survive from before Christianization. But would All Hallows Eve have its spooky associations without the influences of pagan holidays like Lemuralia and Samhain? That's something we can't know for sure. Ultimately, the meat of the holiday is mostly Christian, but inside there might be something of a pagan, spooky, scary skeleton, and I think that suits the season well. Thanks for watching everybody, and happy Halloween, All Hallows Eve, or Samhain, whichever you prefer.